All right, we can now build a theory of ADHD with a deeper understanding of what it is and what's going wrong and what it means for treatment. And that's what I'm about to do. Now, in fairness, I need to tell you that this is my theory of ADHD, that there are other views of executive functioning besides mine, and some people think that those are more useful in describing the problems in ADHD, but of course I don't, and I've spent the last 26 years of my career working on and thinking about and researching my particular theory of ADHD. And I think it's fair to say that it's the most comprehensive view of executive functioning and ADHD we have. But more importantly, it's the most useful view. And that is because it generates so many clinical and educational recommendations for how to deal with ADHD that the other views of executive functioning don't do. They're pretty sterile. They're based more on the computer view of the brain. And frankly, I don't think they're very useful. If they were, I wouldn't have developed my own theory of executive functioning. But if you want to, you can read more about my theory in my books, particularly my book in 2012 that is called The Executive Functions. So let me then take you through my view of executive functioning, and it's going to show you why it's important to view ADHD as EFDD. Now, an executive function, in my view, is an act of self-regulation. Let me explain. We have more than 20 definitions of an executive function and how many components might be involved in that. So there's a real mess out there in research on executive functioning with all these different definitions. And some people have said we should just quit and give up on the term executive functioning. I don't think so. I think we can rescue this term very quickly by realizing that executive functioning links up with self-regulation. And we have a very good definition of self-regulation, and you see it here. Self-regulation is any action I direct at myself, and I'm going to do that in order to change my behavior from what I might have done automatically. And why do I want to change my behavior? Because it improves my future. It makes it more likely that I will succeed. It increases the chances of getting rewards and avoiding harm or punishment. In other words, it changes the probability of a delayed consequence. So, to review, self-regulation is an action I aim at myself that I'm going to use to change my behavior from what I might otherwise have done if I hadn't done this, right? So my automatic behavior is going to change. And I'm doing all of this to improve my future, to increase the likelihood of earning rewards and avoiding punishments down the line in the future. Now, that's what self-regulation is. That's a very good definition. All I did was to say that an executive function is the first line here. It's the self-directed action. What are you doing to yourself that succeeds in changing your behavior from what it might be automatically? What did you do? And in my view, there are 7 executive functions. There are 7 things that people do to try to control and alter their behavior. And those are what other researchers call the executive functions. But I'm going to redefine each of them as an action to ourselves, something we are actively doing to try to modify our own behavior in order to improve our future, in order to succeed at getting our goals done and getting the rewards and other consequences that go with accomplishing our tasks and goals in a timely manner. Now, in my theory, each of these executive functions develops at a slightly different time. so that they all don't come out at once like a flower blossom. Instead, they're like building a set of steps, a hierarchy. We get one, then the next, so that over the course of child development, we will see each of these executive functions coming online and maturing and giving us yet another type of self-regulation. So each executive function is a kind of self-control. And humans have 7 kinds. 7 things we do to ourselves. It will take 30 years for the frontal lobe, the executive brain, to complete its maturation, approximately. And so it will take about 30 years for all of the executive functions to develop and mature and be able to be used effectively. But by the time we're in adulthood, we are using all 7 of these executive functions. I think of them as mind tools. We're using all 7 of them like a Swiss Army knife that has the different mechanisms built into it to control ourselves, to succeed at improving our future. It's a wonderful thing that humans have, and it's not shared with any other species. Some of our closest relatives, such as the chimpanzees, for instance, in evolution, right, have some of these executive functions, but only modern humans have all of them. And it's why we've come to dominate the planet. It's why we are the most successful species that has ever evolved. It's our principal means of survival, of adapting to our environment, is this executive brain, which is why it's so big in modern humans. Now, there are 3 things I just want to touch upon here that separate my theory of executive functioning from all the others, because none of the others say anything like this. First, my theory says that an executive function is an action to yourself. You're doing something to yourself to change your behavior. We'll talk about what those are. But if you must, let me give you an example. Suppose you want to make sure you get your goals done today. One way to ensure that is to write them down and make a list of the things you want to do. And by writing down, you're engaging in a form of language, speech to yourself. In this case, it's written language. But that's going to change your behavior. It's going to make it more likely that you're going to get your work done today. So by talking to yourself and writing your words down and keeping the piece of paper in front of you, you've altered your behavior from what it might have been that day if you hadn't written down your goals and plans for the day and the steps you want to use to get to them. So an action to the self is an executive function in my theory. And that's very important to understand. Nobody else says that. Right? The second thing to keep in mind is that these actions that we're doing to ourselves start out in early childhood as being observable. We can see children doing these things. For instance, right around 4 or 5 years of age, children start to talk to themselves. And we can see that. They're talking out loud whether anyone is in the room or not, while they're playing with their toys, for instance. So self-speech begins very early, and it begins out loud. But as the child matures over the next 10 years, they develop the ability to inhibit the movements of the face and the tongue and the lips and the larynx, and they begin to suppress them so that you can't see them anymore. They begin to disappear. I call it they become private or privatized. Some people call it internalizing, but I don't think anything's becoming internal. I think simply what you're seeing here is the brain has the ability to suppress the muscles of the movement of speech while we continue to use the speech center in the brain to talk to ourselves. So now we can talk to ourselves and nobody can hear us. Nobody can see us doing this. But in early childhood, The speaking is out loud. It hasn't become inhibited yet. But if you think about the development of children, you will immediately recognize that this is true. Little children talk out loud. We can hear them. By the time they're around 7 or 8 or 9, they're doing things like this. See, the face is moving, and they're counting to themselves. Perhaps they're doing arithmetic, but you can't hear it. It's not audible anymore. And then as they get a little older, they might move their lips a little bit, but you can't see it very easily anymore. And by the time they're up in their late childhood or early adolescent years, you can't see the face moving at all. But it is. I can measure it. I can put little measuring tools, electrodes around the face, and I can see that even when you talk in your mind, your face is still moving a little bit, but it's moving so little that it's not perceptible to other people. You can't even feel it yourself, but it's happening. So we know that mental speech, speech to the self, the mind's voice, if you will, is really based on public speech, with the face being suppressed. So I can talk to you as I am now, or I can talk to myself as I was just then. And there's a switch in the brain that determines whether the speech is going to come out or stay in the mind, stay in the brain. That's what I mean by privatizing. Over the course of development, these executive functions going from being publicly observable actions to gradually becoming inhibited so that they're only being done in the mind. And by the time we're adults, we can do all of these executive functions in our head. The third thing about my theory to keep in mind is that as these actions to the self begin to develop, as we talk to ourselves, it works. It controls our behavior. We reach a point where these self-directed actions actually govern what we do. So I don't want you to miss that point, because that's separate from, we could talk to ourselves and it might not do any good. Like when we sing to ourselves while we're driving or taking a shower or something, we're not using that for self-control, right? But we can use our speech to control ourselves. So just to remind you, what is so important about my theory that is so different from everybody else's is I say that an executive function is an action to yourself, that it starts out as being publicly observable in early childhood, but that it gradually moves to becoming inhibited in its external expression, so that the muscles of the body don't move anymore, and now it takes place in the mind. And as it comes to be inhibited and internalized, it begins to guide behavior in a very powerful way. What we think can control what we do. And that's how my theory explains all of that. It's very important. Here's a diagram that shows that if you have trouble thinking about it. Young children start out over here, behaving to the world around them. But as with speech, they reach an age where they start doing things to themselves. Maybe they talk to themselves. Maybe in order to stop a behavior, they go like this and they cover their mouth. Or maybe they learn to sit on their hands if they want to stop a gesture or a hand expression. But they do something to themselves. But we can see it. It's visible. But as they get older, over here we can see that it becomes private. It doesn't leave the brain anymore to become public. There's a switch in the brain that stops the signals from leaving the brain and going into the spinal cord and creating behavior. Now, what we're doing stays in the brain. It stays in the mind, and it isn't being expressed anymore. And that's how we get to the executive functions being internalized in the brain. I think that's pretty neat. And it's a wonderful theory of explaining how these executive functions develop, but also how they probably evolved in human evolution. Now, here are the 7 executive abilities. Each is an action to the self, and they develop in a hierarchy. So the ones you see here come first, right? And then eventually they lead to the development of the 3 at the top. Let's take a very quick look at each of these executive functions. The first one that develops is we start to attend to ourselves, self-directed attention. What does that give us? The beginnings of self-awareness. We're monitoring, we're aware of what we're doing. And that simply comes from directing our attention at ourselves. Now, by itself, that isn't going to do any good unless we get the next one, which is inhibition. We begin to develop self-restraint so that we are able to inhibit our actions. We are aware of our actions, and if we don't like them, we can stop them. So inhibition is very important and develops very early. The next thing that develops is that we are able to see to ourselves. Now, some scientists call this nonverbal working memory, but it really is visual imagery. And it's not just images. We can actually use our other senses and direct them at ourselves so that I can hear to myself. I can rehear conversations that I had yesterday with my son. I can smell to myself. I can re-smell the aroma of a particular food, like pizza that I had last night for dinner, and I can recall the smell and the taste of it as well. So we can recall all of our sensory impressions and hold them in mind. And that's how we describe them to other people. If we couldn't do this, then we couldn't describe it verbally to others. But we can. But the most important of our senses for human survival, beyond all the others, is vision. And so we're going to concentrate on visual imagery, or nonverbal working memory, which I don't find a very helpful term. So that's what self-directed sensing is. It's seeing to ourselves in our mind. And that's very important because, like a GPS in your car, we're going to use images to guide us to our goals, to our destination, just like we do with our GPS when we drive. The fourth executive function over here is called verbal working memory by other scientists, but in my theory, it's self-speech. We learn to talk to ourselves, and eventually that becomes private, and we have a voice in our mind. That's another form of self-control. We can talk to ourselves all day long and encourage ourselves to do things, remind ourselves to do things, and otherwise question ourselves when we are having a problem and we need to think it through, and we can self-interrogate our behavior, our memory, and come up with new solutions. These 4 then are what I call the level 1 executive functions. They develop very early in childhood. All 4 are active before 7 years of age. Each will take about a decade to reach its full maturity. But once they start to mature, they allow for the 3 above them to begin to occur. And among these, one that I've already mentioned is the ability to control your emotions. Humans have the ability to self-direct emotions at themselves. We can create emotions in ourselves. How do we do that? By thinking of an image of the past, perhaps of something funny that we saw, or if we want to have a grief reaction, we recall an image of an event where we really did grieve the loss of someone that was important to us. So by using images of our past, we can bring back the emotions we felt at those times in our past. And that's how we can create emotions. It's how actors are able to do it. And we can talk to ourselves about those past events. And that way we amplify the emotion even more. So if we want to have a grief reaction right now, if I were an actor and I needed to grieve as part of a play that I was acting in, I could immediately think of an image of when someone I loved passed away. And I would talk about that. And by doing those things, reimagining and talking, I would get the emotion. I would grieve. So humans are able to activate emotions by thinking about their past. And we need those emotions to help support our behavior along the way. Why do we need them? Because emotions are motivations. And that means that if we can emote to ourselves, we can motivate ourselves. Motivation, self-motivation, is essential for goal-directed behavior, for aiming behavior at the future and sustaining action toward that future until the goal is accomplished. That takes self-motivation because there are no consequences occurring around us when we are pursuing our goals to sustain that action. We have to do it ourselves. And we do it by creating positive, supportive emotions. By thinking about the goal, by thinking about the rewards, visualizing them, we can activate our motivation and stay the course, pursue the goal, finish the task, earn the rewards. The last executive function to develop occurs later in childhood and adolescence. Remember I said that working memory is holding images and words in mind to guide our behavior. Well, the last executive function is where we can hold things in mind and manipulate them, move them around, take them apart and recombine them to think of new ideas, new arrangements, new ways of doing things. It's the inventive, creative part of the executive system. It's where planning and problem solving come from. The ability to hold things in mind and play with them. Take them apart. Look at different rearrangements. Think about them. Will they work? Can they solve the problem? And that's where the planning function comes from. And it's from internal play. It's based on play during child development. Children play so long in development because play is crucial to adult problem solving. So now you see the 7 executive functions, each of them redefined as an action we do to ourselves. We attend to ourselves. We inhibit ourselves. We see to ourselves and hear to ourselves, but we also talk to ourselves. And we use all of those to create emotions in ourselves when needed to support our goals and our problem solving. And that allows us to create motivations in ourselves to stick with what we're doing, to stay the course, to persist toward the goal and the future. And if we encounter a problem along the way, we can stop and play with information in our mind and think it through and try to come up with various ways of overcoming the problem, various options to solving it. And then we choose one, get around the obstacle, and complete the goal. It's fascinating. It's almost miraculous how the frontal lobe of the brain allows us to do these 7 things. And we do them in concert, interactively, in order to control our behavior. By the time we're 30, we have all 7 of these, but they don't develop all at once. What does ADHD do? It interferes with the development of all 7 of these, and it delays their development, leaving the person with ADHD without the capacity to do these as effectively as other people are able to do. This is just a description of those executive functions and what they lead to in daily life. How do I know that you're using your executive functioning? Because I can watch you and I can see that you show self-restraint and inhibition. I can also see that you manage yourself relative to time, that you can follow a time interval, get things done within a time limit, get them done by a deadline, and you can organize what you're doing throughout the day so that the timing of it is optimized. I can watch you plan and problem solve and create and come up with multiple ways of doing things. I can see that you're able to self-motivate to get work done, that you don't need the approval and praise and rewards of other people to get your work done. You can do it yourself. And that tells me you have internal motivation. And of course, I can naturally see that you are regulating your emotions in a more mature and thoughtful way so that they are more supportive of your friendships and your family relationships and your goals in life, your longer term welfare.